Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. The current standoff between Russia and the West has many nuances, but ultimately one core reason, at least as far as Moscow is concerned, and this is NATO's eastward expansion. Is Sweden, rather than Ukraine, the next country to join NATO, and what would it mean for European security? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Swedish journalist and peace researcher Jan Oberg. Mr. Oberg, thank you very much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. I'm not a journalist, I would like to say, but it's my pleasure anyhow.
Well, I've seen quite a number of your articles. That's why I called you a journalist. In fact, one of your recent articles that you wrote not so long ago was entitled "Sweden's Elites More Loyal to NATO Than to Their People." And that's a pretty controversial statement. What makes you say that?
Well, first of all, the foundation that I'm the director of is an independent foundation. That means we can say what we want. We are not dependent on state money, and we're not dependent on corporate money. And that means that we are doing free research. And my point is that the last 20 years or so, basically since Olof Palme died and since the EU membership of Sweden, Sweden has stopped having an independent foreign policy. We have come very close to NATO without a formal membership application yet. This has happened basically without any public discussion. There's not a wish to have a public discussion, which was originally Sweden's basic policy, that everything we did in terms of common security, neutrality, disarmament and all that was something that was anchored in a public discussion, and the Swedes would know what their country was standing for. So I think this loyalty among elites is a problem, because we need a public discussion, a much more intensive discussion about whether to join NATO or not, and how we get Sweden to contribute again to disarmament, including nuclear abolition.
And formally speaking, Sweden is, of course, a non-aligned and neutral country. And yet, if we look at some of the recent statements and actions taken by Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt, who played a very hawkish role, I have to say, in the Ukrainian crisis, you know, you'd think that Sweden is more fervently pro-NATO than some of NATO's founding members. How do you explain this sudden shift from neutrality to de facto interventionism?
Well, it's good you're taking up the neutrality, because we are formally non-aligned in Sweden, but neutrality was scrapped long ago. The argument was that after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you could not be neutral because there were not two parties to be neutral between. This, of course, is intellectual nonsense. We could still have neutral states who would be helpful, for instance, as mediators in the international conflict areas around the world. So how did it happen? Well, there were people who wanted Sweden to finally say goodbye to everything that Sweden originally stood for and get closer to the United States and NATO. This was run particularly by the Social Democratic Party and Prime Minister Göran Persson and Foreign Minister Anna Lindh at the time. It was a policy shift, simply.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder how much of this policy shift, this U-turn in Swedish foreign policy, could be really attributed to the power brokers, some of the names you just mentioned, but I would like to bring up the name of Carl Bildt once again, because his ties to the US military industry are well known. It's not secret, and you know, he's believed to have made millions on the war in Iraq because of his previous position as a former board member at the Legg Mason investment firm. And I guess his views on foreign intervention haven't changed much since then. So I wonder if this U-turn, this shift that we mentioned earlier, is more institutional in nature or simply due to the influence of particular individuals.
No, well, that's a combination, of course. I mean, Carl Bildt is not responsible for the overall change of Sweden's position on international affairs. But at the moment, of course, of the last 6-7 years, he's been the foreign minister and a former prime minister, too. I have been surprised myself, because it's not really statesmanship to compare Russia with Nazi Germany in the case of Ukraine. And a very hawkish attitude also, and an ill-founded attitude to the question of Georgia in 2008. But I do not like to see foreign policy in general as just run by individual interests. There is an influence, of course, from that. But this is a political, ideological struggle. And as I said to you, if the argument is that you can't be neutral, you cannot have your own policy anymore, you must belong to one camp, You know, it's a very limited intellect that decides that. But if you operate on that assumption, then you end up where you end up, namely in confrontational policies. What I would like to see as a peace researcher is a diffusion of this tension in Europe and a solid negotiated solution to various problems, be it Syria or Ukraine. But, and that's what we have to say, you know, if what you have on your shelves are fighter airplanes and a lot of militarist equipment, then that is what you choose rather than intelligent conflict resolution. To put it crudely, if you only have a hammer in your toolbox, you will see all problems in your home as something that has to be hammered down.
Sweden has this reputation of you know, democratic, progressive and peace-promoting society. I mean, if Americans and Russians agree on anything, it is their image of Sweden as this enlightened democracy. And yet, you know, when you talk about people like Mr. Bildt, again, somebody who made money on war, on the killing of hundreds of thousands of individuals, you know, in this country, Russia, you know, we are always criticized for corruption and democratic record, but I don't think even in Russia, a person like this with such a track record could rise to the position of foreign minister, let alone prime minister. So I wonder if Swedes see any problem with their newly found foreign policy direction and, you know, the man who spearheads it.
Well, let me tell you, this is not a Swedish problem or a Russian problem only. It's a global problem. There's something called the military-industrial media academic complex. This is structures outside democratic control, as Eisenhower said already in the 50s. And we have the same in Sweden, we have it in Denmark. I think it's time the world finds out that, well, of course, Scandinavian countries are democratic and relatively welfare-oriented and you know, the image you say we have. But if I may remind you, Denmark has participated in wars all over the place since '99 when we bombed Yugoslavia. We've been in occupying power for 4 years when the present Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, was the Prime Minister of Denmark. We are in Afghanistan. We were a major bomber together with Norway in Libya. And we were the only country together with France who thought that it was a good idea to follow the American idea of bombing or intervening militarily in Syria. These interests are money interests. They are very close allies between money people, corporate people, and politicians. They are supported by the majority of the Western so-called free media, and there's nothing to be surprised about. What I'm concerned about is that it always are small people around the world who pays the price for these policies. And I don't think that we can have a democracy if we continue to have the MIMAC, the military-industrial media academic complex. It goes against democracy because you go out in any street anywhere in the world and what people want is peace. But what they get is militarism instead, and military conflict resolution, which never solves the problems in the first place. You look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Libya, you look at Syria, you look now, wherever you turn, where military has been used and war has been, you know, the solution, things are worse today than they were before. My foundation is working for the norm of the United Nations Charter, which everybody has forgotten and violates, from east to west, north and south, that peace shall be established by peaceful means. The Charter of the United Nations is a Gandhian charter built on the idea of scrapping war, abolishing war, and when humanity has problems with each other, we negotiate, we talk, we consult, we facilitate, we treat each other as human beings instead of bombing each other. This is a civilizational problem that is much bigger than Sweden and Carl Bildt. I'm sure it's much bigger than Sweden and Carl Bildt, and yet, as you just pointed out, that sort of attitude seems to be spreading all across the Scandinavian peninsula. One country, your neighbor, Finland, is also discussing a possibility of joining NATO. And of course, for both Finland and Sweden, this non-alignment approach was a very cost-effective way of ensuring their security during the Cold War. Does it mean, the fact that they are publicly talking about joining NATO, does it mean that they see modern-day Russia as a bigger threat than the Soviet Union? Oh, yeah, well, that's a perversity of today, that people are arguing we need to join NATO today when we don't have a Cold War and we don't have a Soviet Union and we don't have a Warsaw Pact, whereas they could survive as neutral states when these things existed. This is bizarre to me. I mean, this is pure propaganda. The Russian military expenditures are 7% of NATO's. Now, if we could survive as neutral states together with Switzerland Austria, Finland, and Sweden at the time with our own defences and not being part of NATO, I wonder why on earth we at all need NATO today when the Warsaw Pact has disappeared. But secondly, I also wonder how could we survive at that time when tension was much bigger, when there were much more nuclear weapons in Europe, etc. So, I mean, this is bad intellectual thinking, but I tell you, the ministers of foreign affairs and defence and prime ministers, at least here, are spending more money on spin doctors and marketing their unintellectual views than they do on listening to experts and people who happen to know something about these things. It's part of a propaganda war.
Yeah, I agree with you on the propaganda side of it, but I think this approach is actually paying off because if Sweden or Finland were indeed to join NATO, that would provoke some sort of reaction on the part of Russia, at least as far as military calculus is concerned. So there would be certain changes in the military posturing, for example, more troops on the border. You know, some of the rockets will have to be repositioned, let's put it this way. So after all, this imagined threat could become a very real threat, at least as far as military planning is concerned.
Well, yes, I don't disagree with you. I have always been against confrontations, humiliations, speaking down to people, threats and all that, because it doesn't help conflict resolution. There is not one minister in Europe who has advisors who know something about conflicts. They may have international lawyers, they may have military expertise, diplomatic expertise to advise them and guide them. They have nobody who knows about nonviolence, conflict resolution, conflict psychology, or anything like that. Mm-hmm. While there are tons of military academies and research centers in both your part of the world and our part of the world, there is no peace academies. Mm-hmm. You can go on like that. There is no resources set off for creating peace by peaceful means. Mm-hmm. So what I would like to have, rather than continuing a long discussion about military threats and confrontations, is to say, and that's what peace research is about. That is like a doctor saying, how will we create health instead of continuing to have a disease? That is to discuss what security and defense is the next 30 to 40 or 50 years. And it is not something we can provide in any country with military. None of what faces humanity, east, west, north and south, none of it can be solved by military means or fighter aircrafts or satellites or nuclear weapons. Military is outdated. It should go like cannibalism and slavery and child labor. It doesn't belong to civilization.
Mr. Oberg,
to kill each other.
I totally agree with you, but we have to take a very short break here. When we come back, peace, as Mr. Oberg just pointed out, is still touted as a universal value, but too often compromised for geopolitical ambitions. Have war and conflict become policy tools? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart.
Trying to clear out the square. As you can see, a lot of people. We're going to be moving this.
It's a genuine war zone here. It looks like a savage war.
This is sort of changing every minute.
No, no weapons. I have my own weapon, which is microphone, which I need, by the way.
Lots of people think that's exciting all the time, but in these cases, you do have to wait a lot for, sometimes for nothing, actually.
There's so many other elements in broadcast journalists that you have to deal with. It's not just only about the story. It's you're being judged. Everything you say is being judged. How you say it is being judged. How you look, you're being judged. Where you are is being judged. All of these elements can add a lot of stress.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing peace and security in Europe and beyond with peace researcher Jan Oberg. Mr. Oberg, just before the break, we were discussing NATO expansion plans, and you can argue that this whole crisis in Ukraine originated from somebody's decision to take Ukraine into NATO's umbrella. This is at least Russia's view of the problem. And while so far Ukraine is proving a bit hard for NATO to swallow, I wonder if Sweden and Finland could become NATO's consolation prizes. How likely do you think it is that Sweden or Finland will join NATO in the near future? And does it really matter at all? Because as far as I understand, Swedish government is already cooperating with NATO without the formal endorsement of its public.
The last 20 years, Sweden has definitely, in all indicators, politically, militarily, technically, etc., moved closer to the US and to NATO. So close that there are people you will hear in Sweden now who says, well, why don't we get married when we're anyhow living as fiancés? And so it is presented sooner or later will be presented sooner or later as the only option. And that is why the threat from Russia is needed. You know, most people think that you make an objective analysis of threats and then you build your defense according to what threatens you. It's the other way around. You have a military-industrial media academic complex, as I mentioned, and to have that running, you construct your enemies.
Speaking about this very close relationship you just alluded to and, this fiancé dynamic, I think earlier this month it was Swedish government which granted NATO and the United States the right to use its airspace for, flying missions connected to Ukraine. So that seems to be like a favor that you would extend only to a very, very close partner. But as far as I understand, the majority of the Swedish public is still against this very cozy relationship.
Yes, you're quite right. There is a clear hesitancy in the Swedish population about the full membership, and that has to do with two things. It will be very foreign and very difficult for anybody to persuade Swedes that Swedish troops should operate militarily abroad in a crisis situation, paragraph 5 of Article 5 of NATO. Secondly, it will be close to impossible, I think, to persuade Swedes to accept nuclear weapons. And if you join fully, you become responsible for NATO's nuclear policies. And as you know, this is a great reason for hesitancy among the people. But you can still threaten. There is something called fearology. If you make people believe that certain countries are going to swallow you tomorrow, you can make people accept almost anything. And it is that propaganda that I'm trying with my foundation and my colleagues to stand up against, because intellectually it's not correct, it's not truthful.
Well, I think it's also not correct on humanitarian grounds. You just mentioned how Swedish foreign policy has become more militarist, but isn't that also true of the broader Western approach? Because, the bloodshed in Ukraine is not the first occurrence. I mean, we've seen similar wars or conflicts being ignited in the Balkans, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, you name it. And it seems that Europe cannot help but being dragged into all sorts of quagmires and wars. Has war become something that no longer scares Europe?
Yeah, that's part of it, If you run wars all the time here and there, it becomes a kind of normal thing. The other thing is that media are doing a great disservice to humanity by always covering war but never covering peace. We don't have conflict journalism, we have war reporting. We have nobody who is interested in peace building and how countries solved their problems before. Without weaponry and without warfare. This is a disease. The drama of war is so fascinating for media, and many media are owned by corporations that also produce weapons, and you see the circle of this media MIMAC complex that I have mentioned. So yes, but there is one good change, and that is that wars between countries has gone down statistically, whereas we have an upsurge in internal violence in many countries, and there you have the argument of humanitarian intervention, that if you have no reason to use weapons anymore, if you can't find a raison d'etre, a reason to exist, then you say, oh, we need the military to bring in humanitarian aid and stop genocides and things like that. The first nonsense about this was Kosovo, where the idea of a humanitarian intervention was sold, of course, falsely, because it had nothing to do with the genocide there, although there were violence. I was a mediator there between Serbs and Albanians for 4 years, so I know that place quite well. But there was not a genocide planned. What the Americans did was to build the Bond Steel base 3 months after the bombing of NATO in '99.
And Mr. Oberg, I think you made a point in one of your public lectures that the West, for some reason, lacks this institutional learning, you know, this ability to analyze previous military engagements and take it in, you know, to take that knowledge into account while planning future military operations. And here in Russia, we sort of have difficulties understanding why the Western memory is so short. Is it because every new generation of decision makers believe that they are smarter than their predecessors, or perhaps is it because war and conflict have become very cynical policy tools? This is a tool of advancing your geopolitical agenda, is it not?
Yes, and I think you have a kind of normalization of violence. You train young men in violence, you have violence in the media, you have violence in the entertainment world, you have violence in books. You go into any bookstore in the world, most of the books will be about history and wars. You can go on like this. We're living in a militarist culture, and we don't even see that we are. If you take Syria, if you take Libya, we could have solved these problems. I know it's a provocative statement. I'm sure we could have solved these problems without weapons. But what do? We pump in weapons from all sides and believe that that helps anybody. Now you have 160,000 dead people and millions of refugees. That's a result of that.
Mr. Oberg, as somebody who reported both from Libya and Syria, I don't think it's a provocative statement. In fact, I believe, and that's maybe a controversial statement to say, that media, especially in the West, are sort of institutionalized to promote conflict because, you know, from the very beginning, they tend to portray conflict in a very stark binary picture. You know, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, we are always on the right side of history. And at the end, rather than trying to, you know, mediate and help the communities come together, they end up exacerbating the differences and promoting the conflict in the long run.
I think you're very right, and you're touching something which I would say is cultural, deep cosmological. It is part of the Christian culture to divide things into two, left-wing, right-wing, male, female, them and us, and etc. I've always argued, you know, with a little smile, that we ought to have more Hindus and Buddhists and atheists doing conflict resolution, because they are able to see things as not divided up in two, but maybe in 30. There were not two parties, the Serbs and the rest in Yugoslavia, for instance, but that's how it was interpreted. Now we see again the confrontational binary, as you say, the West versus Putin and Russia. Mm-hmm. And it's always this, there is only these parties. There's the good guys and the bad guys, and you know there is no conflict in the world where all the good sides is on one, all the good guys are on one side and all the bad guys are on the other. This is propaganda, and this is the deep culture. It is something we're not aware of is not true, because I don't think that all journalists are militarists or want war. They are simply not aware that conflicts are much more complex and may have 30 parties and not two major parties.
Well, but Mr. Oberg, all the history books exist for that exact reason, to learn something from history. And if journalists decide to go to war zones, I think it's incumbent on them to try to educate themselves. Now, you mentioned propaganda just a while earlier, and I would totally agree with you that there is a very deliberate attempt to present this conflict over Ukraine in black and white pictures, black and white colors rather. But at the same time, what I think we can see both in Germany, in France, in the United States, there seems to be also a divide within public opinion. Not all people are buying this very black and white picture. I wonder if we can take that as a positive sign that some people in Western societies are actually developing an antidote to all that militarist rhetoric that their governments and their media have been feeding them for years.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that opinion has existed all the time. What our problem is that opinion, the 98% of humanity who wants peace and not weapons and war, they don't get through the democratic process because the militarist system is outside democratic control. Secondly, what you're pointing at here is a specific phenomenon that I think we're seeing these years, and it's a clear indication, one after the other, that the U.S. empire is slowly but surely going down. The U.S. is going down because, and you can read Toynbee and macro historians and everybody else, it's going down, all empires go down when they over-militarize, when they lose legitimacy in the eyes of other people, when they overextend their power, and you have 600-700 base facilities in 130 countries now by the US around the world. And all this, of course, at some point falls apart. And I take it as a very good sign and an indicator that America was not able to start a war on Syria, which was threatened again and again, partly thanks to your president's intervention and the idea about chemical disarmament of Syria. But the NATO allies did not come up and follow the US in, let's have another war in Syria. Now, Ukraine is the Western policy there is falling apart also because it is hot-headed. It was a coup d'etat attempt in Kiev by the West. And all these sanctions, which is now, have no relevance in this case. Sanctions is not a tool. It's not a tool in Iraq. It was not a tool in Iran that serves any good purpose or conflict resolution. So it's falling apart.
But Mr. Oberg, as it's falling apart, it also costing a lot of lives, as it cost in Syria, as it costing in Ukraine. And I'm sure there will be some people who will suffer from those sanctions in Russia, albeit hopefully not a great number. But we all know how difficult it is to put an end to the conflict. For example, Syria, I mean, we mentioned this country several times throughout this program. But I wonder if you have any tips on how to avoid starting one, because if we go back to the situation in Ukraine, most historians, most political analysts would agree that it had all the makings, all the potential conflict, divided population, strategic geography, struggling economy, and yet for more than 2 decades, up until the last year, the elites in Ukraine avoided that conflict. Do you have any tips on how not to start a war?
Yes, it's very simple. Peace is something we can learn. Conflict resolution is something we can learn if we have academies, if we have school education, university courses, if you could take MAs in all countries in conflict understanding and conflict resolution. We could phase out the military, because the reason people use military, fall into war, is that they don't know better. They are conflict illiterates. They don't know the letters and the sentences of peacemaking.
But Mr. Oberg, maybe that's exactly the opposite. Maybe they have all the knowledge about the conflict and they're using that knowledge to, continue stirring trouble around the world, because it would seem to me that war and peace have become political categories rather than humanitarian categories. And I wonder how we can make them universal, how we can make peace a universal value once again that would be put above all other considerations, including political considerations.
Well, I would be a little disagreeing with you here. I think a lot of people, let's exclude those who want war and who are psychologically, mentally ill, who want war and love to see killing. But I think most people accept war. Ordinary citizens and others, they accept their politicians going to war because they don't see alternatives. And therefore, it's not enough to criticize wars and weapons or interventions. What we need is somebody who says how it should be done instead, and that's what my foundation and a few others are doing. We're saying how it should be done instead, not just criticizing, because criticizing is a dead end if you don't have solutions.
Okay, Mr. Oberg, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I really appreciate you being on the show, as well as the work that you've been doing all around the world, especially in the Balkans, mediating among those communities.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, please keep the conversation going on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages, and I hope to see you again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.